As many of you know, in health coaching and beyond, we alternate conversations between the two of us, chewing over hot topics, latest news and emerging ideas, but also bringing you conversations with thought leaders and people we admire in the field of health coaching and beyond. This week, it's Tim and I again, and we return to the topic of chronic pain management, a subject that's always been close to our hearts because it's where we got to know each other in the pain clinic. There are a number of new emerging techniques in the field, and Tim and I have been exploring these. We've been attending training, hearing experiences of other practitioners, and considering how they add value in each of our own practices. We know lots of health coaches and people who use health coaching skills are exploring and using many of these new techniques. We always remain curious about how new ideas fit in with the core principles of health coaching, keeping people in the driving seat themselves and ultimately empowering them with their own set of skills and ways of living life that works for them. What's most exciting and interesting to us is that with new techniques comes new hope and opportunity for recovery. At the same time, we're also old enough now to realize health and wellness is constantly evolving, as is the world around us. And we're all on a journey of discovery and learning. In our experience, it rarely pays off to think you have the complete answer. Our understanding will continue to deepen, and we must remain ever curious and open to new discoveries. At the same time, it's important to critically reflect on how and why things are working for different people at different times. Especially in pain, we recognize the complex interaction of how the mind and physical body connect and influence each other, and the range of social, psychological, and biological factors, amongst others, that influence the ongoing experience of pain. We hope this conversation supports your ongoing exploration for what works for you and any people you support. Hello, Tim. Good morning. Welcome back to another chat between you and I.
Morning, Ollie. Yes, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's always good. It's always good to have a conversation. Yeah.
Yes, and the kind of field of health coaching is evolving, isn't it? And you and I have always been interested in chronic pain management. It's where we met, wasn't it? It's where we developed our passion for health coaching, really, and saw how effective it could be. And the field of chronic pain is evolving all the time. We've talked a fair bit about it on the podcast, haven't we? But we're going to revisit it again today, aren't we?
Yeah, I suppose it's not surprising because, like you say, that was kind of how we both found our way, I think, into health coaching, was realizing that was the approach that seemed to work well for people who were living with long-term pain. So yes, maybe it's not surprising that we're returning to it, but again, we're returning to it for a specific reason, I suppose, and one of those is that we've both had over the last 12 months, we both had some training, some new training in chronic pain management, and some of that we've been sharing with people, and we may have touched on it a little bit in the podcast previously, but you've just finished your pain reprocessing therapy training.
Yes.
With the is the Pain Psychology Center, isn't it, in the States?
The American one, exactly. Yeah, so Alan Gordon and his team over there. A really well-delivered course, great content. I mean, it's 22 hours in total. And, you know, what's really interesting is there's a resurgent interest in pain reprocessing therapy, or perhaps you could say pain reprocessing techniques as a whole. And, you know, as clinicians, GPs who have had a real special interest in this, we're always curious, aren't we, about new things that are coming out. The Boulder back pain study was published in 2022, and you know that really shone a light on a fairly robust set of evidence that these sort of techniques can have real impact in people with long-standing chronic pain, perhaps where other things haven't really had much impact, or certainly nothing as significant as demonstrated in the Boulder back pain study. So it piqued our interest. And I've been on a training course.
Yeah. And I suppose what for me is it just feels a bit more hopeful. Do you know what I mean? When, like you say, lots of treatment modalities don't really work that well for people with long-term pain. So it is, I suppose maybe we need to be a bit careful, don't we? Because we kind of jump on this thing that does seem to kind of offer a bit more hope. But I think that feels like is promising in terms of the results from the Boulder back pain study.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I suppose maybe it also fits with the way that we're going to think about how pain kind of comes about and how it's maintained. So Yeah. So I'd love to hear a little bit in terms of your experience of the training, and also I'd love to get on to kind of how you've managed to kind of translate that into your into some of your practice. Because again, it's all very well to go on a really lovely training program, isn't it? But actually, it's only when it translates into what you do in your practice where it counts. So
Yeah.
yeah, say a little bit about what pain processing reprocessing therapy is, and a little bit about what you learned on the course, Ollie.
Well, I certainly will, but I think you're absolutely right. Just a caution. I mean, we've learned this across our careers, haven't we? You read a new book, you go on a course, and suddenly everything seems to fit that paradigm, doesn't it? That old phrase, when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So you do something new, it's in the forefront of your mind, and you start to look for ways. It kind of creates a bias for you, doesn't it? That this is the answer to everything. I think we've learned across our career to be cautious about that, haven't we? And that there's no doubt there's no one size fits all, and that you've got to work out how your growing toolbox and your growing kind of wisdom to be able to work out what's the right tool for the right person at the right time fits in, as you say, into your regular practice. So that's been fascinating, and hopefully we can share a bit around that. So pain reprocessing therapy, I guess it's built on the premise, which I think we share, that a significant amount of chronic pain is neuroplastic in origin. And by that, we mean that it's not related to significant tissue damage that's driving the pain. It's more complicated than that. And it's primarily driven by the neurological kind of web in our brain, the neurological sort of I guess, patterns that build up over time, and that these are influenced by all sorts of things. So, if you have tissue damage, if you do image, you fall over, break your leg, you get kicked in the stomach, there's some inflammation, tissue damage, bruising, trauma, that will cause sensations to rise up into your brain, and very often it's interpreted as pain, as a sort of useful indicator that something's wrong and you need to just adjust your behavior whilst it heals and settles down. So that's the sort of pain that we're really often used to. Neuroplastic pain is perhaps when that pain system that we're used to for that acute sudden pain gets persistently stimulated by other things, I guess, really. So it could be ongoing signals from damage that causes long-term pain, and in long-term conditions with long-term inflammation, long-term cancers, long-term sort of rheumatoid arthritis, those sort of ongoing kind of damage, you may well get a significant amount of signal from the tissues. But you're also getting inputs to the brain from all sorts of other things that influence your pain experience. So your emotions, your memories, your habits, your expectations. When you've had pain for a while, you build up these kind of sort of learned pathways, a bit like sort of conditioning. We all know that Pavlov's dogs, that classic conditioning experiment where, they rang a bell when every time a dog got fed, and it was salivated when the food arrived. And then after a while, it would salivate just to the bell. So we get conditioned, and we know that happens a lot in humans. So there's all sorts of complicated things that happen with pain. But if the pain is predominantly not driven by tissue damage, but by other mechanisms, then we have to think about other ways of trying to turn off that set of nerve patterns in our brain, I guess. So I don't know if I've explained that very well. Does that come across all right?
Yeah. I think that makes sense, Ollie. And I suppose some people may have had some tissue damage, of course, that started the process, but actually that tissue damage then heals up, and people still end up with pain persisting long after that. So it's not that some of this. I mean, some pain can arise. The neuroplastic pain can arise without tissue damage at all,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But equally, some of that neuroplastic pain persists after the tissue has healed in some
Yes.
cases as well.
Exactly. And I guess it comes back to this principle that, pain is primarily a protective mechanism, isn't it? So, the brain is interpreting all sorts of indicators of threat, of which, of course, tissue damage is one. But there are lots of other things that influence that sort of threat perception. So, your social situation, your like I say, memories of common patterns that you found threatening in the past, and just habits that build up. But, particularly if you feel unsafe for some reason, doesn't feel safe to move, doesn't feel safe, you just don't feel safe generally, you're very likely to make pain signals. So in this context of threat, I guess, really, and then the neuroplasticity, I guess, is that, plastic means it can change, so that you get changes in the neural networks in your brain primarily, but your spinal cord has a part to play as well, and to a small degree your peripheries. So the way that whole unit works, I guess, gets locked into a pain experience, a pain sensation that's enduring, but nevertheless is not related to an underlying tissue problem that needs fixing, perhaps in the traditional way that medicine would have focused on fixing tissue damage, through medicines, through therapies, through, surgery if necessary. So we're looking at a different treatment paradigm, I guess, really. And it's in that context that pain reprocessing therapy sits.
Yeah, and I suppose it's just also because I noticed you have put some things out on LinkedIn recently, and I know you have had some comments back, and I've seen comments from other people as well saying, that there's people with real pain. I'm thinking that where this doesn't work for people with real pain, and I suppose it'd just be really worth saying at the outset that all pain is real.
Yeah.
All right, it's not that some people are making it up, because pain is generated in the brain. In all pain, it's all real. It's not some people are imagining it, and some people's pain is somehow less valid than another person's pain. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, isn't it? Almost that, like, if you've not got tissue damage to have caused the pain, then your pain is not real. And I think that's what we've really got to get beyond, isn't it? If you have a pain experience in your brain driven by tissue damage or not, it's real. And in fact, my own personal experience and what I've heard from lots of people is that neuroplastic pain that's, not got underlying ongoing tissue damage, it's probably worse than tissue damage pain, I reckon. It can amplify, it can get out of control, and be a lot worse. The experience can be a lot worse than people that have got an injury. Sometimes when you know what's going on, you've I don't know. I mean, you've got you've had a broken limb. Even I've had broken bones. And you sort of know what's going on. They're painful at the time when they happen, but they settle down quite quickly. I've had other pains that have endured for months and months and months that probably fit into this neuroplastic category, and they're really deep, gnawing, vicious, electrical, sort of like, they just get under your skin, and they're horrible, absolutely horrible. So yeah, all pain is real.
Yeah, really, it's really important, because otherwise people can sometimes go away with impressions that sometimes people are making it up, that it's all in their head and all that kind of stuff. And I think, and I know Howard Schubiner would say, that is just one, it doesn't understand the modern pain science, and also it's really just really unkind.
Yeah.
For people to kind of have that impression. So I'm glad we just got taken a moment just to kind of
Yeah,
really
exactly.
underline
So
that.
if you've got pain, if you're experiencing pain, it's always real, no matter whether it's caused by tissue damage or not. But I guess this is the key tenet to pain reprocessing therapy, is that if you understand that you can have pain without tissue damage. In fact, it turns out the majority tends, it is the majority of the volume of pain we see out there is actually mostly not be driven by ongoing tissue damage. In the Boulder back pain study, around 85% of back pain was not related to underlying ongoing tissue damage. So if we understand that, then we can start to look at alternative ways of diffusing that sort of response that is enduring in the brain.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So what did you take away from the course that you went on, Ollie? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I think pain reprocessing therapy is a set of techniques, really, and I guess the first thing is understanding the pain science, people getting their heads around that and knowing that, and then to some degree finding credible evidence for them that their pain is likely not driven by tissue damage. Because if you're holding on to a kind of thought that it must be some tissue damage that needs fixing, it's then really hard for the brain to change its mind, if you like, and for the neuroplasticity that's set up to change. Plastic means it can change. So you're aiming to change the way the neural patterns are firing in your brain. So if you're not convinced that that's going to be useful, then it's probably not going to work. So finding evidence, and some of the things that indicate it is neuroplastic as opposed to tissue damage. It changes quite quickly. It might move around. I mean, I've had the experience. I'll have pain in one hip really severe one day, and then it'll be in the other side another day. Do you know what I mean? And that doesn't happen when you've got tissue damage. Other people describe that. One some certain things like sort of sometimes noise or horrible sort of stress and pressure, all those sort of things can aggravate the pain, and it'll go up and down quite quickly. So there's a range of factors that can indicate that this is unlikely to be tissue damage, which would probably be more persistent and consistent, stay in one place. And usually there's an underlying reason why. You'll know what you've done. So, pain that comes on for no good reason or reignites for no good reason, but a pain that you had 10 years ago suddenly comes back. So there's a lot of things we can do which perhaps indicate a positive diagnosis that this is neuroplastic. So a lot of PRT is building that evidence base together, making people curious about things they could notice that would help them to, feel confident that's what's going on. And then there's a sort of a set of techniques, I guess, really, that help you then to defuse that sense of threat and the need for protection. I guess that's the whole idea, really. And some of those techniques are, work really well for some people and not so well and others. So it's around finding the set of techniques that work best for the person you're working with, really.
So that is I suppose that's where the coaching bit comes in, isn't it? Is that very personalized approach? It's not kind of like here's the treatment. This is what you need.
Yeah.
You're going to tailor that depending on how people respond, I suppose, in the moment to the different tools that you might use.
Absolutely. And I think this is exactly why health coaching is so relevant. I guess why we found it so relevant in the chronic pain clinic, wasn't it? We found, didn't we, that when people started to regain their sense of control and, that they were in the driving seat and there were things they could do, whether that's pacing their activities, whether it was using medication in a slightly different way rather than relying on it all the time. It was that sense of confidence, I think, that we noticed. And I think that's quite core to pain reprocessing therapy, because if you start to believe, actually, there is hope at, light at the end of the tunnel, there is hope here. And there are some techniques that I can do rather than relying on somebody else. And, you start to see some success. That really helps as well. So one of the key things around PRT is something they call somatic tracking, which is starting to sort of, I guess, become curious about the actual sensations you're experiencing, and trying to look at them with a sort of slightly impassionate approach. I think when we have persistent pain, we tend to get really hyper focused on it. We tend to sort of really get absorbed by it. It grabs our attention. It's supposed to. And I guess that reinforces these conditioning responses. So if we can start to take a slightly different view of it by becoming aware of its qualities, its color, its distribution, its intensity, but look at that with a sort of, they talk about a lens of safety, but look at it almost a little bit impassionately. Some of the times I've heard it described as looking at fish in a fishbowl. So you're sort of trying to observe your pain experience without all the emotions and worry and fear that goes with it. And I guess they're all just ways of reconditioning the way the brain responds to the pain. And you're trying to sort of defuse it, deregulate that kind of threat and worry and anxiety that, not surprisingly, goes with it. So that experience of somatic tracking, you become, I guess, mindfully aware of what's going on with it, what the experience is like. You try and look at it through a sort of lens of safety, what they call safety reappraisal. And then the last bit of somatic tracking, which I think is really crucial, actually, and I think is good for life in general, is trying to be a little bit less intense about it. Like I say, try, and that it can be very different for everybody. And finding how to do that, I think, is, again, quite tricky. Tricky as a therapist, tricky as a patient. But it's something about sort of having a less of a kind of tight grip on your awareness of the pain. Like you're grabbing a steering wheel really tight in your hands. You're really aware of everything, every movement, every sort of, threat that might come to that part of your body that's painful. And just trying to loosen your grip a bit. Um,
Mm.
which even when I'm talking about it now, it sounds a little bit vague, doesn't it? And I think the skill of this seems to be exactly as you said. There's no one size fits all, but it's around working with somebody to help them to be curious, to invite them to be brave to some degree and try some different sort of techniques, but find the one that works for you.
And I'm as I'm listening to you, what I'm noticing is that this is quite a journey that well you've been on, but also you need to take people on, and you can't force people into doing this kind of work. It has to be led by them, and I suppose there has to be a good level of trust and rapport that you build up with the person you're supporting if you're going to do this type of work.
I think so, yeah. And I think, that actually having been on the course and then trying to practice it and put it into action, it's actually challenging. It's really quite challenging because, there is no single formula for everybody. There's some themes I talked about that you go through. And there's some sort of like there's some contradictions almost here. Sort of pain is supposed to make you feel on edge, on the sort of hyper alert. In fact, part of the driving of neuroplasticity is your sort of natural flight and fight system, your sympathetic nervous system is highly activated because pain highly activates that, which then feeds into the way you hold yourself and the way you think. So you're trying to sort of like diffuse that, but it doesn't feel like it's the intuitively the right thing to do. So, you know, trying to bring in humor and lightheartedness when you're thinking about pain seems contradictory. It's not a lighthearted, humorous thing. It's horrible. It's miserable. But nevertheless, if you can reprocess the way your brain reacts to it, so there is a bit of lightheartedness and humor, it seems to be really effective. So, but how do you do that with someone? How do you do that without them feeling like you're patronizing them or you're not taking them seriously? So it's a real skill about how you can invite people into a slightly different way of thinking about it, in a way that doesn't feel, belittling or patronizing or undervalues their experience.
Yeah. So tell me, Ollie, I mean, you have been putting it into practice a bit. So tell me a little bit, but what has your experience been? Again, maybe not obviously details of people you work
Yeah,
with,
yeah, yeah.
but what's been your experience?
Well, again, very varied, I'd say. So the somatic tracking, for instance, it relies on people sort of, visualizing and conceptualizing things, almost using your imagination. So, you might sort of say, well, tell me where your pain is, well, it's in this part of the body. You might say, well, what's it like? Has it got a really clear margin or has it got sort of like a fuzzy, tell me a bit about it. And you might go into the nature of it or the color of it or the sound of it. And some people are really good at that. They'll go, oh, yes, it's pink and it's got fluffy edges and, oh, it's a bit spiky and it's kind of, it's pulsing and, oh, it's actually got a bit of a sound to it. They can really get into it. And you can then work with that to sort of like try and maybe shift it a bit or make it feel a little bit less threatening. Maybe they can use their imagination to do things with it. Or primarily just observe it and just become curious about it. But for other people, that's really difficult. People don't find that easy at all. They'll say, well, it's just pain. It's just pain. And so I think it's really interesting what works for different people, and so sometimes people actually find movement, patterns of movement associated with it is a great way of reducing the threat, and maybe sometimes even a mantra of, it's just reminding yourself, I'm safe. Although I'm feeling pain, there's no threat here. It's not dangerous to me, kind of replaying some of these positive reinforcing thoughts whilst they are paying attention to the pain can be useful. So there's lots of different tactics, I think. And this is me at my early stage of learning this. So, I think it's not just super simple and easy, but it's when you find something that kind of people get hold of and start to work with in a different way, they start to see some change, and then that is a positive reinforcement in itself.
Yeah. And I suppose the other thing I'm noticing is that they need to go at quite you will go at the pace of the person, but probably slower than you think. Because actually, I can imagine you'll get some people and you'll be talking about kind of what does it look like, and people will be really looking at it for this lens of intensity and trying to change it and trying to get rid of it by the end of the session almost. It's that kind of, and if it's still the same, actually somehow it's not work. But actually,
Yeah.
if we want to kind of dial down the intensity and just observe it, then we're going to expect actually we're just gonna observe it. We're not going to try and change it or manipulate it in any way. We're just going to notice it, I suppose. Is that kind of where you
Yeah,
need
absolutely.
to?
And again, that's one of the other sort of like kind of dilemmas about this. Really, is that like sort of some people go at right. I've heard about this pain reprocessing therapy. I'm going to get really good at this. you know,
Yeah,
I'm going to resolve my pain quicker than anybody else has done, which creates an intensity in itself that is counterproductive to the process. So there's this phrase I've heard Alan Gordon use, who's one of the main proponents of PRT, that you have to trust the process. There's a sort of set of ways of rethinking about things that seem quite unnatural, quite counterintuitive. But if you trust, regularly practicing these, you are likely to change the way your brain is processing the pain. And over time, that's likely to loosen the grip on it and to down-regulate it and to let it dissipate away, which is what we're aiming for. So you can't do this with intensity. It's more around, in the same ways you get conditioned to anything, it's kind of like just learning a new pattern that you trust and you become familiar with, that is less threatening than previous.
yeah, yeah. Great.
Yeah, I've
I
done a lot.
mean,
So, Tim, I've done a lot of talking anyway, and I don't know. This is a point in time. It's a sort of journey, and I know a lot of other people are on this journey as well. There are a lot of other people who are far more expert on this. But equally, you've done a bit of learning recently, haven't you? So, you went on Howard Schuberner's course, thinking about sort of emotional expression and awareness therapy. Have I got that right?
you almost got that right.
Almost.
Well, I did do, yes. It's Howard Schuberner's Freedom from Chronic Pain course. And again, it was a similar thing. I went on there was a recorded program, and then you were encouraged to buddy up with someone. And I budded up with someone from Ireland, actually. And we met a number of times in between the sessions to kind of practice the techniques and things. So, yes, we definitely did the pain reprocessing therapy, but there were other things as well that they touched on. A bit internal family systems. They touched on that, and they also touched on emotional awareness and expression therapy, EAET, which I hadn't come across before. So it was interesting, and I suppose what they were comparing it to were things like ACT and CBT, and I suppose those other ones. In terms of studies, they kind of show that they do benefit, but it's very marginal benefit. Whereas they felt strongly that EAET, emotional awareness and expression therapy, had a more positive impact on people with chronic pain. So exciting. And again, I suppose what I like about it is then that it's not just one technique. It's not like PRT or EAET. It's kind of a combination. And I suppose a skilled practitioner would move between these different tools and techniques as you were describing, rather than, okay, this is the program. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So emotional expression and
Oh,
awareness.
close, Ollie,
I
close.
can't. I can't get it right, can I?
Emotional awareness and
Yes.
expression therapy.
Right.
So
Okay.
being aware of the emotion and then encouraging people to express it. Um, so
And how does that help then? So expressing your emotions. What's the theory behind that then?
well, I suppose the theory is that a lot of pain, because it's an alarm signal, isn't it? From the threat system being activated, can be driven by unexpressed emotions.
Mm,
And therefore getting people to identify what those emotions might be and giving them the opportunity to express them as fully as they can, um, is releases that, and that's that. Therefore, the threat system then just kind of calms down because they're not now holding on to this thing which is driving it. Which I suppose anger would be one of the ones that they would identify. And that was interesting, I suppose, for me, because I do think that anger is one of those emotions which is, I think people find it really difficult to express and probably feel that they shouldn't express. Do you know what I
mm.
mean? There's a lot of guilt and shame that comes around kind of people expressing anger. as well, and they feel like they shouldn't do it. So I suppose that's the emotion that it mainly centers around because people don't express it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you're encouraging people to express anger where they've perhaps not expressed it before, or hidden it, or bottled it up, or maybe it's not been safe to do that. I mean, that's a common pattern we see in people that have trauma experiences, isn't it? Is that they're exposed to trauma, particularly as children, where they're extremely vulnerable. And it's just not safe for them to express what they might naturally express, and that can be
Exactly.
the root of building up, persistent pain, I guess, in this
Yeah.
context, but all sorts of sort of unhelpful, persistent patterns.
Yeah.
Have I got
So
is
you
that right?
So yeah, exactly right. So again, it is something that I think takes quite a lot of practice and quite a lot of confidence to do because people won't naturally. It'll feel quite strange to them
Mm.
to kind of be in maybe a a room with you as a practitioner, and you're getting them to go back to a time when maybe a kind of an experience where someone hurt them, or a kind of a hurtful experience that they had, and for them to in some way express what it was, what they wanted to say, and how angry that made them at the time, and actually express it in that moment with you in the room to express what that felt like. There's other ways you can do it. People can write stuff. They talk about kind of you have that unsent letter. Do you know what I mean? You can write to someone who hurt you in the past. You can express everything about it, but you don't send the letter. You just kind of but because the work is just getting it out. That's the
Yeah,
work.
yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so you go back to a kind of maybe a hurtful experience. You would encourage people to really go for it. I mean, not just kind of gently just explain how hurtful it was and how angry they were, but really express it. I mean, shake your fists, clench your fists, and really rage about it.
Mm.
And yeah, how Howard Schumer was saying, do you know something? Sometimes it got quite graphic. So you need to be up for that because it gets quite graphic because people are really expressing it's sometimes a quite violent kind of thoughts. But
Mm.
what he would say is that that's an important thing to do. It's not that people will go and be violent. They are expressing it in that session. And I suppose that's kind of feels like a safe space for people to do it. But important for people to express it fully, and then I suppose it's not that's it. That's not the end point. The end point then, okay, so having expressed it, are you then able to in some way let go of that
Mm.
and give some compassion to yourself?
Mm.
Maybe even find some compassion for the person that was hurtful towards you. Not definite,
Mm.
but the most important thing is be compassionate to yourself that actually that anger is justified,
Mm.
and therefore you don't need to feel guilty about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and yes, you might feel sad, and you might even feel depressed about it. But again, it's just um, uh, giving those emotions a bit of space as well.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
makes sense.
And it's interesting that we as doctors are starting to sort of consider these treatments. It's interesting, I think, that a lot of the health coaches we see around the country, some we're working directly with, others we're reading about, are starting to pick up these techniques. And I mean, I know there's some critiques. I sort of feel it myself as well. Some of this perhaps is just superficial techniques on top of really deep seated, emotional traumas. And that perhaps, psychotherapists would say, look, you're messing in our territory. You're kind of like playing with some of these techniques, and, you're not quite sure what you're doing, if you like, really. It's interesting, isn't it? Nevertheless, a lot of these techniques seem to be incredibly powerful, incredibly effective for people where other things really haven't worked before, and very doable in a more perhaps superficial way. You're not having to go down and completely unpack everything from a sort of deep rooted psychotherapy point of view. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tim? Because it's where are we going with this?
Yeah, I think it is really important that people remain within their scope of practice and their training, and
Mm.
definitely not just go off and try these things. And definitely, people need to have the training in order to do it. Um, but what I'd say is, for me, the most important thing is that the person that you are working with, they absolutely stay in the driving seat.
Yeah.
It's not us pushing people down a particular path. It's inviting people, if they want to try some of these techniques, but again, hold them lightly, as in, at any point you find this, you're feeling dysregulated, or you're not feeling like you're in control, then it's okay. Just come back out. I think that's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, as long as we're not in the driving seat, I suppose, forcing people to go beyond what's comfortable for them. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And if I was going to critique PRT to some degree, I think sometimes it can be come across as quite directive in that you're sort of you're slightly trying to convince people that they've got it wrong in the past and the way they've conceptualized pain is wrong, and this is a, this awareness of neuroplasticity and this awareness of rethinking things is the total solution. And I think what you've said there is really important about having these techniques up your sleeve, being able to invite people to explore them and find out what works for them. But we've seen, haven't we, before PRT came in, we saw a lot of success in the pain clinic with people starting to sort of pace their movement again and starting to feel confident that they could start, reestablishing some movement patterns. And that was incredibly effective for some people without even any of this PRT or without any sort of, emotional awareness or expression therapy. So we're built. It feels like we're building up a range of new insights and a range of new potential tools. But what we mustn't do is feel like we've got the answer for people, and that dynamic again of doing things to people and telling people what they should think or do. Is counterproductive, isn't it? I think that's where the health coaching mindset is so important to hold.
Yeah, and therefore where health coaches might be in a good position with additional training, by the way, not just not just to kind of give it a go, but with additional training. I think they are, because they have got that mindset. They have got that mindset, and they don't just use one particular approach. Health coaches that are experienced draw on lots of different techniques, and lots of different approaches, lots of different models, and tailor it to the person in front of them. So yeah, and again, I mean, these techniques aren't. Would you? I mean, I don't know, Ollie. I mean, you learn them, so
Mm.
I'm guessing they're not difficult. But I mean,
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, if I can learn them, anyone can learn them. Yeah.
so we can all learn them. We can all learn them with have appropriate training. We could all learn them. Um, but yeah, but the skill is knowing when to bring them in, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, learning the techniques is just a very small part of it, isn't it? Because applying the techniques or working together with an individual who comes with a whole load of unique sets of contexts and previous experiences are just that's the tough bit, isn't it? The sort of like you've got this bolt-on set of techniques. When we were doctors, you know primarily in the pain clinic, we were giving epidurals to people, weren't we? We were prescribing strong opiate medication. That was, we were working as medics in that situation. And those are the tools we drew on. And for some people, they were effective, not all the time, but some of the time, and sometimes I know every patient I work with will use a pain relieving medication to, you could say break the cycle of pain experience for a bit. It helps, makes you feel more in control, gives you a bit of confidence. But of course, we found that if you become over dependent on medication, you're using them all the time, they stop becoming so effective. You start to feel less control. You get side effects. So, there's nothing that sort of like is absolutely off limits, I would say, but there's also nothing that is entirely always going to be the solution for someone. So it is complicated. And I think as we journey this together as a group of interested, let's say, helpers, for want of a better word, we all bring different techniques, we all bring different styles. But I think at the core of it, why I really believe in health coaching, the core of it is that you want to try and keep the person you're working with in the driving seat. Whatever you do, however you teach people to adopt new ways of working or thinking, if the ultimate outcome is that they know how to manage their own body and their own situation, then that's the sustainable endpoint that we're aiming for, I think, really. So however we use these techniques, we have to end up with them feeling more confident and capable about how they go on to live their lives, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, exactly. So if rather than you have to go and see this person to have this thing done to you, it's something that you can do yourself. Maybe, with support. And I know there's a curable app which, goes along these lines, which people can do some stuff for themselves. And I'm sure there are other resources out there as well. It's always helpful to have someone accompany you, and which is why, building communities and pain cafes and things where you get people, that peer support, I think that can be really helpful, and other people to kind of help guide. But ultimately, people need to be in control and in the driving seat. So I'm glad we've ended there, Ollie, because I kind of think that is
Well,
almost that's the take-home message, eh?
yeah, I think so. And I think, that's where all these things, we all need a bit of, we all need to be helped, don't we? Sometimes we all need some external sort of confidence boosting, and it can come in all sorts of forms. It can be a massage, it can be having some acupuncture, it can be having, joint manipulation. They all have some degree of, they do something for us, don't they? They change some patterns of the way our nerves are working. They change our confidence level. We feel like we've been supported and helped, which can boost us, but it should all be building blocks for how we're building our internal capabilities, I think. And at the end of the day, the more we rely on external stuff, the less we are really building our internal capabilities. But nevertheless, sometimes we all need some external help just to help that internal bit build. So I think it's getting that balance right. And I think that's where we're wanting to support health coaches, aren't we? To find techniques that you can support people with. But there's a lovely phrase which I keep in mind. Cormac Russell, who is someone I've always admired with his asset-based community development, he talked about leading walking backwards. So even in community development, you're sort of like, you're trying to help communities to be independent on their own. So you're doing it by walking backwards. You're gradually walking away. And I think that's what health coaching is all about, really, is bringing in, making people aware of new things they weren't aware of, helping them to make sense of them and put them into their right context, but nevertheless, you're trying to walk backwards because you're actually encouraging them to take the lead over time.
Great. That's probably a really good place to leave this conversation. Now, we could talk quite a bit longer, I'm sure. And again, maybe in a few episodes we'll bring you an update, because obviously you're putting these new techniques into practice. So it'd be good to kind of hear how that is going down the line. That would be really good. But for now, I think we will draw our conversation to a close. But it's been really good to hear about your experience and see how it's working for you, Ollie.
Well, likewise, Tim. We're both on a learning journey, aren't we? Do you know what I mean? And I think I know you continue to do a lot of coaching yourself and put these things into practice as well. So let's enjoy sharing the journey with other colleagues. And we're all on the learning path, aren't we?
Great. Nice to talk to you, Ollie.
Cheers, Tim.